Welcome back into the Lions247 Podcast. I'm Tyler Donohue. He is Sean Fitz, and working our way through the final full week of January here all of a sudden. About a month out now of the early signing period, just about a week and a half away from that traditional February signing day, which has certainly lost its luster over recent years. But Sean, a big story in January has been Penn State welcoming recruits back to campus and getting on the road and checking out those recruits in person, getting into some schools all over the country. We've seen a lot of that during the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, we've seen junior days on back-to-back weekends. Penn State had an official visitor in this weekend. Hunter Norzad, the Cornell transfer, was up for his visit, which huge visit if you're looking at the specter of the transfer portal for Penn State. But yeah, they had another junior day, kind of an in-betweener, as we talked about before. Next weekend's list, this weekend's list, the 29th list, is shaping up to be a really nice looking list for Penn State. But this weekend, they got some guys on campus, a bunch of 2023s, some new offer 2024 kids. So yeah, it's just kind of continuing to hit the ground running. The coaches are on the road once again. So January continues to be an active recruiting month.
Yeah, a bunch of coverage up on Lions247.com coming out of some of these visits from this past weekend. There were some local guys like Kenny Johnson, the receiver. And then you had, again, some far range. You're going to have that again coming up here this weekend as they get some non-regional guys to venture to campus. And we'll talk about Norzad and that visit in a second, Sean. But Jaywan Sider, among those posting pictures from the road, he did so on Tuesday morning as we are still in hibernation mode here in Happy Valley. He's certainly not. A beautiful sunrise looked like in the state of Florida, which is where you often find Jaywan Sider when they go on the recruiting hunt. He's with Anthony Poindexter. There's a wide net cast right now by Penn State. You've got some new coaches involved here. You've got some familiar coaches involved here. What is your read on the January that Penn State has put together and their ability to go out and execute it?
Well, they've logged a ton of miles. I mean, you look at their traditional recruiting zone, but they've expanded that. Obviously, if you have Jaywan Sider, you're recruiting Florida. He's down with Anthony Poindexter in Fort Lauderdale, South Florida area, where he's accustomed to recruiting. Manny Diaz popped up in Tampa this morning, checking out schools. John Scott was in Tampa last week. Terry Smith gets down there. So Florida still a high priority. Hasn't wielded the numbers that you would have hoped, and obviously throwing a pandemic with no visits straight smack dab in the middle of it doesn't help. But they're hoping to get some guys up for more visits. And it's kind of like what we talked about with John Walker and Derek LeBlanc, a couple of kids that were up last weekend from Central Florida. You're kind of setting the table for a June official visit, maybe a May, because now the way that it works, and I know people have kind of forgotten about this with the way things went last year, but that official visit window where you pay for their trips and they come up and the whole family comes up and everybody has a great time, is April through June. Then you have the dead period in July, dead period in August, essentially just that little window, that lash bash window at the end of July, and then you get back into the season. So this is your time to set the table. This is your time to get in and get your face around. We saw James Franklin pop up, saw Tyler Johnson yesterday. Saw Tyler Johnson in Virginia yesterday, worked his way up. He's in Maryland today, was at Good Counsel this morning, the home of Neo Avery, who was up over the weekend for that junior day. We kind of glossed over that junior day. That's my fault because you set me up and I just kind of threw it right back at you. But yeah, a good bit of talent on hand. Not, like I said, not the first weekend, not the last weekend, but you had Anthony Brown in the Minnesota commit. Talked to him a little bit this week. He likes what Penn State's saying. He still says he's solid to Minnesota. He's also going to visit Purdue this weekend. So read into solid how you want to read into it. That's kind of what you've got right now. You mentioned Kenny Johnson, the wide receiver from Dallastown. Roden Hannafin was down from Massachusetts. A pretty impressive player. I don't know that he's, one of the top guys on the board right now. It'll be interesting to see how that wide receiver board shakes out. I wrote that in our zone the other day. There's a bunch of, I don't want to call them no-brainers, but you got Rodney Gallagher out there. They really like Ajani Shakir in South Jersey. National guys, Jalen Brown down in Florida is probably going to get up for a visit. He's a really highly regarded guy. So you've got those kind of guys, and then you've got a bunch of questions. Where does Johnson fit in? Where does Hannafin fit in? Anthony Brown, of course, was up, and you're going to continue to host wide receivers now. But moving on, you got a couple guys from the Philly area. Austin Ramsey, who was a freaking house at 6'4", 360. He was up this weekend, kind of definitely a project there from Roman Catholic, but you had him up. I think the interesting one here, in the 2024 class, Peter Jones, the offensive lineman from Malvern Prep They had him on campus for camp over the summer, liked what they saw and wanted to see some film on him, and they offered him. This is a kid. Grew up a Penn State fan. Brian Doan had an interview with him the other day. Grew up a Penn State fan. I mean, you've got everything going for Penn State right now, just in terms of that. And I don't want to do crystal balls for 2024 prospects just yet, because it's a little bit early for that. And, guys we were talking about a year ago in the 2023 class might not be on the radar anymore. And you'll have that in 2024. Kind of happens every year. But Peter Jones is definitely a name to remember. You look at the offensive line class in 2024, and as I said, way too early to be talking and speculating on this, but you got Peter Jones at one end of the state. You got Cooper Cousins in Erie at the other end of the state. So a couple of early offer prospects for Penn State in the 2024 class on the offensive line. So you're not where you want to be offensive line recruiting. We've talked about that too many times, I guess, right now, but you're setting yourself up, and there's certainly talent there in the next couple of classes in the region.
Peter Jones listed 6'4", 290 as that rising sophomore prospect at Malvern Prep.
Big boy.
Of course, yeah. Lonnie White signing with Penn State, or not signing with Penn State, but not ultimately enrolling because of the MLB opportunities he's had. But that's not too distant past relationship there with the Malvern Prep program with that commitment. And Jones, as you said, really making it clear with his interview with Brian Doan, this was the program that he was focused in on Saturdays growing up. And when you hear that right off the jump, when an offer comes out, yeah, you put yourself in a really good spot. A long way to go with that group. But if you can find premier talent, or what you determine is an offerable talent on the offensive front at this stage of the cycle, and you find those guys here on home turf, that's a good start. There were a couple of players who came in from Ohio, Tavion Galloway, who's been a bit of a more popular target now for Power 5 programs in that 24 class, and Jaden Ball, both those players out of the central Ohio area, made the trip last weekend. And as you said, shaping up to be another strong closeout to January here for Penn State, and just reiterating the fact that these visits, coaches on the road, players coming to campus, they were completely off the table last winter because of the NCAA's response to the pandemic, and you're getting those full arsenal of official visits for the 2023 class. As Sean said, April through June. Last year it was, you got June, go make the most of it, and it was crazy. This time should be able to get a little bit more of a less of a scramble and more of a structured layout for the staffs, for the recruits. We would hope so. Sean, of course, the transfer portal now coincides with the recruiting trail. You can't really talk about one without talking about the other in roster construction. Penn State, very quiet so far compared to where they were last year at this time in the transfer market. One player on board at the wide receiver position. We've talked a lot about offensive line being a necessity. Hunter Norzad, about a month ago, I suppose now at this point, popped up as a realistic, viable option. That continues coming up to campus this past weekend. You've been on this story for a while. Penn State picked up an Ivy League transfer last year. He ended up being their starting left guard. They have a need. How could Hunter Norzad address it, and where does he stand right now in his decision timeline?
I think he could address it pretty well. He could be an interior guy for Penn State, even though he played tackle at Cornell. This is a guy that they've identified as one of the top offensive linemen in the portal, regardless of your background, regardless of where you've played in the past. Norzad is a guy that's turned some heads, and you look at what's still left there. He put out his top 5, which included Penn State, Iowa, Illinois, Auburn, and Virginia Tech. It sounds like 2 of those programs, sounds like Virginia Tech and Auburn sort of making their way out of the discussion. So you've got Penn State, you've got Iowa, who obviously their offensive line pedigree is quite good. Kirk Ferenz is going to visit him this week. And you've got Illinois, which, that is an up-and-coming offensive line program with Brett Bielema. I almost slipped and said the wrong word for him. But that's an intriguing option for a transfer. They're going to bring in a lot of transfers out there. But Penn State hosted him this weekend. Sean Clifford, Juice Scruggs. I mean, they threw the book at him this weekend. And hopefully for Penn State's sake, when you need to patch holes in that offensive line, you're going to bring in a guy that's ready. I think Norzad is ahead of where Eric Wilson was, better than him. And with the notation there that Eric Wilson didn't have a season because of the pandemic in 2020. So, him coming and jumping right back into the Big Ten, probably not ideal, but I think Norzad can play at this level. I like him. Tyler Steen, who we talked about before at Vanderbilt, I like Norzad a little bit better. I think he fits as a plug and play guy a little bit more. Steen has talent, but is he ready to start right away at Penn State? It's hard to say. Now, having said that, they'll take both of them if they can get them. I mean, Steen's been a guy that they've been, they went down and saw last Monday. Norzad has of course been, I think, the top target on the offensive lines from the outset. And he's got another visit for Iowa this weekend. huge visit. And then I think he makes a decision. I think it's one of those 3 Big Ten programs, and we'll see where Penn State comes out of that haze.
And while he's trying to sort through all of these options, which were not on the table for him coming out of high school, ended up at an Ivy League school, of course. He's still working on that academic stance at the Ivy League, getting a degree in mechanical engineering before he heads to his next stop. So a couple things on the table for him.
Yeah, but he's not looking. I don't want to say this because this is probably, not fair to a lot of the grad transfers, especially the Ivy League guys. He's not looking for a great degree. He's not looking to go in and earn a master's or earn a doctorate or whatever, and maximize his academic proficiency. He already went to Cornell and got an undergrad degree. He's fine.
Yeah.
He wants to play in the NFL. He wants to come in. He wants to start. He wants to play. That's the outset or the outlook for a lot of these guys coming in. And if you're, I know we've done this on our board a little bit, breaking down grad programs and stuff like that. It's kind of fruitless at this point. He's looking to play football. He's looking to spend a year playing football and then play at a professional level, which is pretty valuable in itself, I would say, looking at some of those contracts. So, you see a guy from Cornell and he's considering Illinois, Iowa, and Penn State. It's not academic. It's I want to play football. I want to maximize my exposure and get where I need to be. And we've seen that work out for a guy like Arnold Ebiketie last year. So that's pretty much your most activity in the portal right now. Steen is still an option. Beyond that, they're still looking at pretty much every guy that goes in. Love to get a pass rusher. Would love to get a linebacker as well. Still looking at receivers, just sort of as a best available option thing. But that's kind of where you're at right now in the portal.
Norzad coming up on his decision again, completing that degree from Cornell, expected to do that late spring and then move on to the next level, which is going to be the Power 5 level. It certainly sounds like the Big Ten Conference based on the way this recruiting is shaping up. Looking ahead, Sean, a little bit beyond, looking backwards a little bit beyond into last week, Daniel George did hit the transfer portal. He's one of those names that we mentioned was omitted from the roster update last week. We were kind of going through that. Him, Cam Sullivan-Brown, no longer on the roster for the wide receiver group. Now a little more clarity there. Daniel George hitting the transfer portal. He'll look to continue his career elsewhere. 2 years of eligibility left. Redshirted in 2018. 2020 had the NCAA's pandemic eligibility pause. But this officially does close the book on that 2018 class, Sean. I don't think we were expecting Daniel George to resurface on the roster once he was off of it. But now that he's looking ahead, him, Justin Shorter finished with fewer than 20 total receptions in their careers. And then you got Jahan Dotson, who blew up and had almost 200 total catches for his career with the Nittany Lions. And it's just a different kind of, I guess, when you read the final chapter and the final notes on this 2018 receiver class, really just turned out so far different than we thought it might. Jahan Dotson, a guy that had committed to UCLA as a senior, ended up working his way back to Penn State's class on signing day, kind of lost in the spotlight with Micah Parsons announcing his commitment to Penn State on the same day. But Shorter, George, Dotson, all four-star prospects. They were followed to campus in that 2019 class by TJ Jones and John Dunmore out of Florida. Neither of them caught a pass. So you kind of look at the situation at wide receiver and understand where we are now, where it's the older guys are year 3 players, and then you're waiting for a bunch of freshmen and second-year players to step up. That's because you got nothing out of the 19 class. And in 18, Daniel George came in, Justin Shorter came in, Jahan Dotson came in. Dotson's on his way out for all the right reasons. And George, while I'm sure we can attest to him being a strong teammate and all that, it just never came together for him. We had floated around the idea of him playing defense, but ultimately it just never seemed like he could take that next step. And I was reminded that he started 4 games in 2019, and I'm reminded that Dan Chisena started games in 2019. And wow, that 2019 team that won 11 games, they'd love to swap that wide receiver group out for this one, I think. All due respects to KJ Hamler, who was a total difference maker, but the room's come a long way under Taylor Stubblefield, and you kind of understand why it needed to when you look back at what happened in those preceding recruiting classes. And by the way, KJ Hamler, kind of like Jahan Dotson, was really the lone man standing in his wide receiver class in terms of making that impact for this offense.
Yeah, they've been fortunate in that they've still been productive, and especially at the top of that list with Dotson, with Hamler, but they haven't been the deepest unit, so they've gotten by, and that's kind of remarkable when you look at all the misses that they had. You go back there, you still got Mac Hippenhammer was through here and starting games as well. I mean, that group has come a long way, but at the same time, there's still a long way to go. And I think that's kind of crazy how that's played out. By the way, how big was that day for Penn State? Micah Parsons and Jahan Dotson. I actually forgotten they were on the same day. That's pretty insane when you think about potentially 2 first-round picks, as you see Jahan, mocked in the back end of round 1. Probably, I would think he's an early second-day pick, but mocked in the background or in the back of round 1 is not easy to say. But no, that's pretty insane right there. But yeah, I mean, you know about the career was shorter. Really talented kid, never came together. George was interesting because the book on George coming out, tremendous athlete, physically, I mean, he looked amazing. Penn State actually had hoped that he eventually, later in his career, when it was apparent that it wasn't happening at receiver, hoped he would flip over and play safety, play linebacker, something like that. But apparently he wanted to play wide receiver. Didn't catch the ball. And that's sort of a step back when you're thinking about playing wide receiver. There was a lot to develop there. I liked him a lot as a prospect. I thought he was going to be good. He was not a guy that was going to come in and produce day one. But once he worked on his route running, once he worked on the finer fluidities of the position, thought he was going to be good. Just did not turn out that way. You'll have that position sometimes. But yeah, it just boiled down to him not being able to catch the ball consistently, which means he wasn't able to get on the field consistently. And really just kind of, I don't want to call it a tailspin, but kind of drifted off there at the end of his career. So, he's always been good to us. He's always been, a good teammate and things like that, but never lived up to that production that we had forecasted for him back in the day. And then I guess you could probably say that for the entire 2018 receiving class, where you've got little to nothing out of Shorter, little to nothing out of George, and then an awesome career from Jahan Dotson. So that balances out a little bit, but still high hopes for that group. Didn't play out how people thought it would, including this coaching staff.
Fortunately for this coaching staff and fortunately for Taylor Stubblefield, who walked in to get this class, that 2020 group looking really strong right now, receiver between Parker Washington and Keandre Lambert-Smith, multi-year starters. And then, of course, Malik Mega, Jaden Dotton are the other 2 names that we've talked about. Mega certainly making some strides late in the season here, but to follow up what you had in 2019 and what you didn't really get out of your 2018 class, that 2020 receiver group, really, really important for Stubblefield, for Penn State right now. And by the way, Daniel George, first career catch, 95 yards, record setter for Penn State in Beaver Stadium, came from then backup quarterback Sean Clifford, 2018 against Kent State. Ultimately, though, that was the only touchdown that that George would score over his career. Sean, a few more notes here, and then we get to our mailbag, a shorter episode this time around after a couple long ones last week. You may have heard of the guy, Dennis Sutton. He continues to make the case for himself to make a rise in upcoming 247 Sports rankings update. Looking to put the finishing touches on these rankings for the 2022 class. And he may not have played a lot of football the last couple of years at high school, but he's been very involved at these showcase events. A couple weeks ago in San Antonio for the All-America Bowl, and then out in Hawaii, lucky him, for the Polynesian Bowl. And it felt like every single day the reports from our 247 team out there were highlighting Mr. Dennis Sutton.
Yeah, you look at what he was able to do out not only in Hawaii, but also San Antonio, and he's on the rise. He's our updated rankings are going to come out tomorrow on Wednesday, and I think he's going to be a guy that moves up considerably, and rightfully so. This kid's awesome. He's a really, really good prospect, really, really great kid. You got 6'5", 260, moves really well, can be a pass rusher, can be a guy that plays the run. I think he can be a guy that plays early as well. He's physical and aggressive in there. And, as I think the only knock on him was that he didn't get to play as much football as, some of that out of his hands, some of it injury related as we hoped he would over the last 2 years of high school. But he's one of those guys. He got up on that level with these top prospects nationally at the old Army game, the All-American Bowl. San Antonio was fantastic. Did the same thing last weekend out in Hawaii. And I'm talking to Greg Biggins and Brandon Huffman, 2 of our guys that were out there in Hawaii, drew the short straw, had to go spend a week in Hawaii and cover that game. They were incredibly impressed with him, not only with his conduct off the field, which we've talked about several times, and we often lead with that because he seems like such a great kid, but also he was still competing, he was still going at it hard. A lot of guys will go out there to a situation like the Polynesian Bowl and coast through the week, enjoy their time in Hawaii, and they have every right to do so, but Denai went out there, competed, did a great job, and I think you're going to see his ranking reflect that when it comes out on Wednesday.
That ranking for 247 Sports right now, currently number 94 overall in the nation, the number 12 defensive lineman, and the number 1 overall prospect out of the state of Maryland. Composite-wise, he's number 58 overall, but high 4-star. We'll see how that's reflected. Again, some updates coming to those rankings on 24/7 Sports on Wednesday. Keep an eye out for that. We'll, of course, put the spotlight on Penn State rankings adjustments up on Lions247.com. Sean, you've been high on this guy for a while, and just circling back to something you said about coming in and playing early. I think I mentioned this during our signing day show back in December, but James Franklin made it a point during his discussion of the Dennis Sutton during that press conference that he feels like he can come in here without the early enrollment head start and still play as a true freshman. And when you're talking about a defensive lineman and a guy who hasn't played a ton of game reps in the last couple of years, for James Franklin to go on the record and publicly state that says a lot about how they view him within that facility and what you've seen these past few weeks. Not only is it, wow, this kid's a heck of a football player, he could do a lot off the edge, he could move around in the defensive front, it's also he has the makings of a future captain. And when you can combine those two things, that's a really strong start. And I'll give credit to those McDonough guys. They tend to have that blend based on those that we've encountered here at Penn State, of course, starting with PJ Mustipher.
Yeah, he's not PJ in terms of being a talker, but he's going to be a lot like PJ in terms of his personality showing through and things like that. So, and you remember PJ came in May as well. McDonough does not allow early enrollees, January kids or things like that. But PJ came in May and played as a true freshman. I would expect Donohue, given what's in front of him at defensive end, to have a similar path, maybe even a little bit clearer of a path to come in and play right away. So I'm really looking forward to seeing how this one developed. As I said, biggest win for James Franklin on the recruiting trail last year, and one of the biggest wins for James Franklin since he's been here. It's been a really, really good, was a really, really good win for him, and I think it's going to pay off. And hopefully, we're talking about him in this draft aspect, a couple years down the line as well.
Looking quickly toward the 2023 recruiting cycle one more time here on this episode, Josiah Trotter, the son of Jeremiah Trotter, former Philadelphia Eagles star with your Washington football team for a little while too during his pro career. Well, his next son up, Josiah Trotter, announcing a handful of schools remain in the mix for him: Virginia Tech, West Virginia, Clemson, South Carolina, Texas A&M, Notre Dame, Ohio State, and Penn State. Maybe a little more than a handful. We're talking about a top 8 here. But when you're talking about a 4-star out of Philadelphia, 6'2", 230-pound linebacker that Penn State moved on quickly after not offering his brother Jeremiah Trotter Jr., who's now with Clemson. This is a step toward deciding things. And I think when you talk about watching older brother go through it and having the dad who he has, you're not going to get much by in this recruitment. So certainly the diligence has been made. He's been on the road a lot. He's gotten up to Happy Valley a few times, and Penn State still in the conversation here for Josiah Trotter, but they've got a lot of company.
Yeah, they certainly got a lot of company there. I'll be interested to see which schools out of that list end up pushing for him. He's more of a traditional Mike, 6'2", 225. He's bigger than his older. That's kind of the crazy thing. You remember Jeremiah Trotter Jr., as you mentioned, went to Clemson, was a 5-star prospect, I think, by the composite. Penn State didn't even offer, which was crazy to think about that as a kid in your backyard, even though you had concerns about his size, you had concern about his projectability and things like that. Typically, those guys at least get an offer. But Josiah Trotter was offered back in May. He's been on campus a few times. He went to the Whiteout last year, so he's been up plenty of times. We go back to Penn State's philosophies on recruiting linebackers. I'm curious to see if it changes with Manny Diaz. You saw for years they just want to recruit outside linebackers and get as athletic as they could possibly get, and then figure out who can play inside from that. It's worked well at times. It's not worked well at times, and you kind of find yourself in one of those waves where it's not working well right now because you've got a couple of Brandon Smith is gone, Ellis Brooks is gone. You've got to replace some starters. So some good targets out there on the board. I know Tony Rojas is going to be on campus this weekend from Virginia. It's a guy that really liked a lot. He's one of those athletic guys that plays on the outside. Grant Tucker's a guy that fits that mold from North Carolina. And of course, Tamir Robinson is Tamir Robinson a linebacker? Is he growing out of that position? There's questions there. So a bunch of linebackers on this board, and I'm interested to see how it shakes out because it's not very cut and dry. It's not the same. Brent Pry's approach was, as we spoke about a little bit ago, kind of avoiding guys like Josiah Trotter, trying to avoid. Excuse me, I am die-in today, and I apologize to our listeners, but guys like Phil Pisciotti, those middle linebacker types, those true Mike types, and I think you need those types, but you need more of the athletic guys that can spread them out and play all over the field, like a Curtis Jacobs, things like that. So very curious to see where this linebacker board goes, which direction Penn State goes with some of these prospects, like Trotter, and see where they stand on the board.
Well, Trotter was down in Blacksburg with Brent Pry last weekend for Virginia Tech's Junior Day, and he came home with an offer and quickly included them within his top 8. So Brent Pry putting his team in play here a bit for Josiah Trotter with his recruitment. And Sean, we've got our 5-star mailbag to get to. I think that's going to cover it. We'll do another longer look at this upcoming weekend on our second episode this week as Penn State gets ready to welcome more recruits to campus. But it's 5-star mailbag time, and it takes us back to the current roster. Here's the question. Now that we seem to know which players are leaving and staying for Penn State in 2022, which positions look like the most complicated to address? The first part of that, yeah, I think we finally have answers to pretty much whatever questions we had in terms of who was staying, who was going. We're going to see more transfers coming out of spring ball, I would imagine, but maybe not so much the guys we're looking at to solve the replacement issues. So, Sean, where do you land on here? Because you can go in so many different directions. You've got stars, all Big Ten status guys leaving. You've got depth concerns in other areas. What immediately, I guess, stands out as particularly complicated?
Well, I think this is the first time we've mentioned this group here, but I think the running backs are the one that you turn to immediately. And of course, you had Noah Cain leave, Kevon Lee's still there, Devin Ford's still there, but you wonder how he fits in the equation. Keziah Holmes is back on campus for the spring, and then you've got the freshmen in there as well. So with Nick Singleton and Katron Allen, I think that's an incredibly interesting position when you take into account that young guys can play and young guys can thrive in that position. And Singleton is a guy that comes in with as accomplished or more accomplished than any other running back that they've been able to bring in. And that includes guys like Miles Sanders, who was a top running back. That includes Saquon Barkley. So we'll see how that plays out. He's an impressive physical kid. And I think he's a guy that's built. And this is probably my concern with Nick Singleton is he built closer to his ceiling than he, physically, because he's a monster. Just, it's the squats, the deadlifts, all this kind of stuff. And Dane at Garage Strength really built him up pretty well. How close is he to being the peak athlete that he can be? That's the question that I have about Nick Singleton. But on the flip side, does that mean he's ready to play right away? Does that mean he can play, as a true freshman? So I think that's very fascinating. Kevon Lee, has been up and down in his career, and maybe it's time that he thinks he's the number one. It's his time to shine, and maybe he takes it and runs with it. So I think running back is always going to be intriguing. There's one ball to go around. There's not guys guys don't stick around for 4 or 5 years to figure out if they can eventually be that guy. So it's an amazing dynamic when you look at this roster, especially with Noah Cain clearing it out a little bit. That running back's going to be really interesting this spring.
And Devin Ford, Keziah Holmes, where do they see themselves? Where does Jaywan Sider see them? What is that whole scenario look like when we get through late April? And how does that maybe contribute to what the running back room looks like? A lot of fascinating stuff. We were having a different conversation last year about there's so many talented players. How can get the ball to all of them? How can you feed all of them? Now it's like, can you find your bell cow? And can you find that 1A, 1B situation that you just couldn't identify last season? A lot goes into it.
Commit to him? Yeah.
Can you commit to it? Of course. Yeah. And that's the question. We've seen this team burn red shirts for freshmen. It happened for Ricky Slade a few years back. It happened for Noah Cain and Devin Ford back in 2019. Didn't need to happen in 2020, but it ultimately would have with Kevon Lee and Keziah Holmes. He didn't sign a freshman last year, but the track record says Penn State's ready, willing, and able to do that. And I think they've got the talent that you'd expect at least one true freshman redshirt to be burned, if not both, over the course of this 2022 season.
And those true freshmen don't come into redshirt. When you're recruiting the top running back in the country, the number 7 recruiting, whatever Katron Allen is, they're not coming in here to sit for a year. Kudos to Keziah Holmes for, taking a step back and essentially taking a redshirt year and then sticking with it and staying at Penn State, because that's not an easy thing to do, especially at that position. Excuse me. So yeah, they're not coming into redshirt. So I think that's an interesting one. As I continue to trample on you when you try to talk, I apologize for that. I'm off my game today. I'm sorry.
You're doing just fine. The area I'm looking at is, how about the specialist room? Because you got 3 jobs that someone's got to take over. And I know that Jake Pinniger took the job back as place kicker late in the year. Didn't get the results you were looking for in Tampa when that happened. But I guess Jake Pinniger won that job, or Jordan Stout lost it over the course of the year. but you still need to replace a punter that was at the highest level of the sport. And oh, by the way, he replaced a punter who was really special too. So you've got what, 5, 6, 7 years of sustained high quality punting. And I know 2020 wasn't nearly as strong for Stout in that department as was in 2021, but I think that's the position that I look at. And additionally, you're going to have to replace a kickoff specialist. So across the board here, you've got a new special teams coordinator. You've got the true freshman now, redshirt freshman in Sanders Zahadak, and you've got this 5th-year senior and Jake Pinniger back on board. To me, it's the kind of conversation that people don't focus on until like week 2, 3, 4, when all of a sudden punts are flying out of bounds and you're losing the field position battle. And so I think, I'm just going to get ahead of that now and point to that room, the specialist room at all, because Jordan Stout wore so many hats. And while he was not a world-class place kicker, certainly was among the best of the best as a punter and just consistently pounding teams with touchbacks as a kickoff specialist.
Yeah, and I noticed you neglected to mention the centerpiece of that unit is back, and Chris Stoll.
He's back, Chris Stoll.
So,
yep.
Yes. No, it'll be interesting to see. You wonder if they're going to use Zahadak to bomb some kickoffs, Pinniger to kick the field goals an extra point, and if Bichetta can come in and take that punting job and seal it up for 4. I mean, how spoiled has Penn State been that they've had guys that are long-term starters at that position? Can Bichetta be that guy? So I agree with you there. It's probably not the answer people are looking for, because as you mentioned, you don't usually have that conversation until they start missing or things like that. But yeah, I think there's plenty of, I mean, you could definitely say this for, a defensive end. For linebacker is going to be a spot that's safety spot opposite Jair Brown. I mean, all over the defense, you can have this conversation, and how does that receiver room play out? So the offensive line is a conversation we're just not going to really touch right now, because we don't need to add another 10 minutes to this podcast. But yeah, I think there's a bunch of places, but yeah, that specialist room is going to be overlooked, and you got a new special teams coordinator. That means he wants to see his guys and see what he can possibly do and change some things up. And I'll add to your specialist conversation with a returner question. I mean, Penn State's return game was non-existent this year. How does Stacey Collins address that? How is he going to make this a unit worth fearing? Because right now, they had some really good, some peak specialists at certain spots, but the return game was not one of them.
Yeah, a great point there. And I don't know how the freshmen will factor in. Caden Saunders is on campus already. Omari Evans has elite speed. Cam Miller, I think, could probably contribute as a return man, but he's not getting to campus till later in the year. Yeah, so special teams, of course, gets a rare spotlight here. And by the way, one of the podcast questions, or one of the mailbag questions for the podcast, I didn't throw in here, but you mentioned it. What do we have to do to get my man Chris Stoll on the pod is a question that surfaced in the last 48 hours on Apple Podcasts. So you're in charge of figuring that one out, Mr. Fitz.
All right, we can do that. I think that's, I mean, he'd have to clear his schedule, obviously. I'm sure he's got a lot of media opportunities available to him. Hey, by the way, I got a DM question, and I apologize, I haven't gotten back to it yet, but asking us where we put those or where we get those questions from. It's from the Apple Podcast reviews. So if you're going to leave a 5-star mailbag question, go to Apple Podcast, leave a 5-star review, leave your question in there. That's where we pull those things from. I got to actually respond to that after we get off of here. So I apologize to the listener and reader that sent that in, but check out our Apple reviews and give us that 5-star review while you're at it, because it really helps us out with visibility, really helps us out with our product and in continuing to improve our product at the Lions247 Podcast.
That's going to do it for this episode of the Lions247 Podcast. We'll be back later in the week with another one. Take a look towards a busy recruiting weekend for Penn State, whatever's happening in the transfer portal, breaking news that surfaces. We'll get to that and more. Thanks to our producer, Lance Glenn. Be sure to follow us on YouTube on our page, Lions247. On behalf of Sean, I'm Tyler. Have a great day. This is the Lions247 Podcast.